All right, to start off this project, we'll go to editor.construct.net. We'll create a new project. Name it Shooter. And the default sizes will work fine for us. And we'll hit create. And this dotted line is going to represent our viewport, which was what we had before. That was the 854 by 480. If you click on the background, you'll see that the whole layout is 1708 by 960. If I use Control and mouse wheel, I can zoom in and out, and you'll see that that's about a quarter of the screen. Next, we're going to load the background for this project. So I'm going to double click to create a new object. You can also right click on object types and do add new object type. I will usually just double click. Here we're going to want to add a tiled background. So under the general section, we'll see tiled background. I'm going to name this background. If I had more than one background, I would give it a name like rocky background, forest background, desert background, so on. Then we'll click insert. We'll get a crosshair asking where do you want to place this object. I'll just click somewhere in the middle, and then I'll load my image. So I'm going to click on the load image from file button. I'm going to go to this PC. Down at the bottom I'll see Stu Share. You'll have less options here than I do. From Stu Share you'll go down to the game programming folder, and inside of that is Alien Shooter, and then you'll see all of the files here. If you want to see what they look like, you can click this down arrow on the more options button for the view type button. And I'm just going to change that to a large icon so it's easier to see, and I'm going to choose my background and hit open. Since there's nothing I want to change with this, I'm just going to close it. And since this is a tiled background, when I resize it, it just tiles that image. Now, instead of trying to line it up perfectly, there's a shortcut, so I'm going to right click. I'm going to do align, and I'm going to do cover layout. Viewport is the part that you can see, so I want to do layout so that it's the entire level. Then I'm going to lock it so I don't accidentally move it now that I've got it perfectly lined up. From there I'm going to create a new object again, so just double click, and this time I'm going to do a sprite. That's also in the general section. You got the little Space Invaders icon, so we're going to do a sprite. I don't want it to be named sprite. I'm going to name it player. Hit insert. It's important to name your sprites because you'll usually have a bunch of those. And if everything is named Sprite 1, Sprite 2, Sprite 3, Sprite 4, it's going to get confusing when you get to the code. So you're going to click to put him on the screen and then hit the folder to load. Choose the player, and that looks fine, so I'm going to close that. And if at some point you forget to name it, so like say I didn't name the player, I can either click on him on the screen, go up to name, and rename it here. Or you can select the object in your project bar and then change the name here. Both of those work. Now we're going to add in our player's movements. So instead of manually putting in each one, we're going to add a behavior where all of that is already done for us. So make sure your player is selected, because if it's not, then you just get the layout properties. So now we have the properties for our object. You want to go down to behaviors. There's probably a blue button that says behaviors. Depends on what browser you're using. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to pop up. Then I'm going to add a new behavior, and the one I'm going to get is under movements. It's 8 direction. So when I add that, it will by default add in that you can move your character with the arrow keys on the keyboard. So if I click the preview button, that'll open up, and then I can move my character around with the arrow keys. I'm going to change that to 300 for the max speed, so it's a little bit faster. And then acceleration and deceleration, I'm going to set those to 1,000 so that you're not quite as much on ice skates. Everything else should be fine. Now when I run that, you'll notice that that seems pretty good, except if I go all the way to the edge, I can go out of bounds. So to fix that, I'm going to add another behavior. So I can go back to edit behaviors. If you left this open, that's fine. Just hit add new behavior from there. And we're going to do bound to layout. That will prevent the object from leaving the layout. So I'm going to add that. And then we'll run that. And we'll see that when we get to the edge, the player now stops at the edge. But we're bound to layout, not the viewport. So if I move off the bottom and go right off the edge of the screen, and same with the right. And that's because there's all this part of the level down here that we can't see because of the viewport. So now we need the camera to follow the player. So we're going to add another behavior, and that is scroll to. Always center the view on this object. So add that, and now when we run it, as we move, you'll see that the background scrolls to the player, at least until we get to the edge, and then now I can't go out of bounds to the right, and I can't go out of bounds to the bottom. The last thing I want to do with just the player is have the player face the mouse so that whenever he does fire, it will fire in the direction that you're pointing. So to do that, I'm going to go to the event sheet. The event sheet has two parts. The left side is the condition, which is the event, and then the right side over here are the actions to take when this event happens. So I want this to happen constantly, so we're going to add an every tick event. So that's under the system object. Or really, the system handles it because it's not under an object. So system, and then we'll do every tick. You don't want to put a lot of things in every tick because that can really slow down the game. But since we're only doing one thing, it should be fine. I'm going to add an action. I want the player to perform this action. And I want them to point at the mouse. Now we won't be able to do that because I'm going to do set angle toward position and hit next, and then when I start to try and do mouse, you'll notice that it's not there. So I believe if I do mouse.x, it's actually going to give me an error that that's not an object. So I'm just going to leave that as 0, 0, and then I'm going to go back and add the mouse. So I can, instead of going back to layout 1 to add, I'm just going to right click on object types and add a new object type. Go down to input. Choose the mouse. The default name is fine. I'm going to insert that. Now I can double click on this action and change that. So I'm going to choose the mouse. It's always best to double click your object to make sure that the spelling and capitalization are the same. If you need a property of your object, you use period, and you'll see that mouse has 4 properties. We want the X, and then here we want the Y. So for the X coordinate, we want the X. For the Y coordinate, we want the Y. We don't want the absolute X or Y because if our game's not running full screen, it's going to go to the corner of the monitor, not the corner of the window. Hit done, and now when we run that, you'll see that the character is always pointing at the mouse. And the player portion of our game is now finished.